The part Sheila remembered years later wasn't hearing another woman's voice. It was hearing her husband promise her something he didn't own. She was standing in her kitchen a little after midnight, exhausted from a delayed flight, one hand still wrapped around the handle of her suitcase when she heard Johnson laughing on the back patio. At first, she wasn't listening. Then, a woman asked him about the lake house, and Johnson laughed. "Don't worry about the lake house." The woman sounded excited. "Seriously?" "Trust me," he said. "In a few weeks, none of this will matter." Sheila didn't move. The lake house was worth nearly $4 million, and it belonged entirely to her. The woman laughed again. Johnson laughed too. And standing there in the dark, Sheila realized she was listening to a conversation her husband never expected her to hear. What she didn't know yet was that the woman wasn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem was that Johnson believed every word he was saying. "Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always do my best to give you the best as I learn and improve every day. If this is your first time watching, comment below with where you're watching from and subscribe to officially join the family." If you ask people around Milton, Georgia, who had the perfect marriage, Sheila and Johnson would have been mentioned more often than either of them realized. Not because they acted like newlyweds, not because they posted every vacation online. Actually, they were surprisingly private. People admired them because they looked solid, successful, established, like two people who had figured life out. From the outside, everything made sense. Sheila built things. Johnson connected people. That was how everyone saw it. And for a long time, that was how Sheila saw it too. At 33, she'd become one of the most respected real estate developers in Georgia. Not because she chased attention, because she earned trust. Contractors trusted her. Investors trusted her. Bankers trusted her. City officials trusted her. When Sheila promised something, people expected it to happen. Not because she talked confidently, because she followed through. Johnson's strengths were completely different. He could walk into a room knowing nobody and leave with invitations to 3 future events. People liked him immediately. He remembered names, remembered stories, remembered details. He made conversations easy. For years, that balance worked. At least it appeared to. Then small things started happening, small enough that nobody paid attention, including Sheila. One evening, they attended a fundraiser in Atlanta. Halfway through the event, an investor approached them. "Congratulations on the Brookhaven project." Sheila smiled. "Thank you." Before she could say anything else, Johnson jumped in. "That one took longer than expected." The investor nodded. "I heard zoning was difficult." Johnson laughed. "You have no idea." The conversation continued. Nobody thought anything of it. Neither did Sheila. Until later. Driving home, she found herself replaying it. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. The project had taken years. Sheila had attended every planning meeting, every city hearing, every financing discussion. Johnson had attended none of them. Yet somehow, listening to him speak, you'd think he'd been there the entire time. A few weeks later, it happened again, then again. At another event, someone congratulated Sheila on a successful acquisition. Johnson answered before she could. At a charity dinner, someone asked about a development. Johnson explained it. At a networking event, someone praised her company. Johnson referred to it as our expansion. Each moment was small, forgettable by itself, but together they formed a pattern. One Saturday afternoon, Sheila finally mentioned it. They were sitting on the back patio, Johnson scrolling through his phone, Sheila reviewing project notes. Without looking up, she asked, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "Why do you keep saying our projects?" Johnson glanced up. "What?" "Our projects." He laughed. "Because we're married." "That's not what I mean." Now he was smiling. The amused kind of smile people wear when they think a conversation is unnecessary. "You know exactly what I mean." "Maybe." She closed the folder. "You talk about the projects like you run them." The smile stayed, but only partly. "Come on." "I'm serious." Johnson leaned back in his chair. "You think I'm taking credit?" She studied him. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he laughed again. Not nervous, not defensive, dismissive. You're overthinking it. And that was the end of the conversation. Or at least, that's what Sheila believed. Years later, she would realize the conversation mattered far more than she understood at the time. Because that wasn't the moment Johnson started changing. It was simply the first moment she noticed. The truth was, something had already begun shifting. Slowly, quietly, and neither of them understood where it would eventually lead. The following year brought the biggest project of Sheila's career, at least up to that point. A luxury mixed-use development outside Alpharetta. Retail space, residential units, office buildings, years of planning, millions of dollars at stake. The type of project that could change a company permanently. And for nearly 12 months, it consumed her life. Most mornings started before sunrise. Most evenings ended with emails. Some weeks she spent more time in conference rooms than at home. Johnson joked about it constantly. At first, the jokes were harmless. Should I schedule an appointment if I want to see my wife? Depends. Do you have financing? Things like that. People laughed. She laughed too. For a while, but as the project grew, so did the distance between them. Not dramatically, gradually, the way most marriages drift. One evening, Sheila came home after a 14-hour day. She found Johnson sitting at the kitchen island scrolling through real estate listings. Not unusual. He loved looking at expensive properties, even when he wasn't buying them. She poured herself a glass of water. What are you looking at? Johnson turned the screen. A lakefront property, massive, private dock, guest house, the works. She glanced at the price, then raised an eyebrow. That's ambitious. Johnson grinned. You never know. She laughed. Pretty sure I know. Instead of laughing with her, he kept staring at the listing, longer than expected, almost like he was imagining himself there. Then he said something odd. So, what do you think our net worth is now? The question caught her off guard. She sat down. Our net worth? Yeah. What brought that on? Johnson shrugged. Just curious. She named a rough number. Johnson whistled softly, then smiled. The conversation moved on. But later, lying in bed, Sheila found herself thinking about it. Not because of the question, because of the interest behind it. Over the years, Johnson had shown almost no curiosity about balance sheets, ownership structures, or company finances. Suddenly, he seemed fascinated by them. A few weeks later, they attended another industry event. During dinner, a younger developer approached their table, nervous, excited, trying to make connections. He introduced himself, talked about a small commercial project he was working on, then asked Sheila for advice. Before she could answer, Johnson leaned forward. Biggest mistake people make? The young developer listened. So many people wait too long. What do you mean? Johnson smiled. They spend years planning. Something about that sentence sounded familiar. The young developer nodded. I guess. You've got to trust yourself. Sheila remained quiet. The irony wasn't worth discussing. Because the young developer had spent 20 minutes describing zoning approvals, financing challenges, and permitting delays. Exactly the things Johnson was dismissing. On the drive home, she stared out the passenger window, street lights sliding across the glass. Johnson was in a good mood, talking about people he'd met, opportunities he'd heard about, future investments, future possibilities, future plans. At one point he said, You know, confidence matters more than people think. She looked over. More than competence? Johnson laughed. That's not what I said. But that's what you meant. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he adjusted the radio, then smiled. You always take everything literally. The conversation ended there, but something about it stayed with her. Not because they disagreed, because Johnson increasingly sounded like someone describing success rather than someone creating it. A month later, another strange thing happened. She arrived home unexpectedly, early on a Friday afternoon. A meeting had been canceled. The house was empty. Nothing unusual, until she noticed a garment bag hanging in the guest room closet. Brand new. Inside was an expensive suit she'd never seen before. The tag was still attached. A few hours later, Johnson came home. She pointed toward the guest room. Big event coming up? He glanced over. Oh, that. Yeah, that. He loosened his tie, needed a new suit. For what? Couple things. What things? Johnson opened the refrigerator. Haven't decided yet. The answer didn't make sense. Both of them knew it, yet neither said so. That was becoming a pattern. Small questions, vague answers, conversations ending before they actually ended. The following weekend, he disappeared most of Saturday. Golf, apparently. At least that's what he said. Then came another weekend, then another. The explanations always sounded reasonable, until she realized she could no longer remember the last weekend they'd actually spent together. One night, close to midnight, Sheila walked downstairs for water. Johnson was sitting alone in the living room, phone in hand, smiling. The kind of smile people don't realize they're wearing. He looked up suddenly. The smile disappeared. Not completely, just enough. You scared me. She nodded toward the phone. Good news? Johnson locked the screen. Something like that. Then he stood and went upstairs, leaving his untouched drink on the coffee table. Sheila stared at the empty staircase for several seconds, not because she suspected an affair, not yet, because the moment felt strangely out of place, like a scene missing part of its explanation. The next morning, everything returned to normal. Work, meetings, schedules, life moving forward. But for the first time, Sheila found herself paying closer attention, not searching for anything, just noticing. And sometimes, noticing is how the truth begins. Because while she was busy building the largest project of her career, something else had been growing quietly inside her marriage, and neither of them was talking about it. The night everything changed wasn't supposed to be memorable. If the weather had cooperated, Sheila would have been home 3 hours earlier. She would have eaten dinner, taken a shower, answered a few emails, gone to bed. Instead, a storm rolled through Atlanta. Flights were delayed, schedules shifted, and sometime close to midnight, Sheila pulled into her driveway exhausted. The house was dark except for a faint light glowing from the back patio. Johnson's car was already there. Good. Maybe he was asleep. At that point, sleep sounded better than anything else. She grabbed her suitcase, unlocked the front door, and stepped inside. The house was quiet, mostly. Then she heard Johnson's voice. Not unusual. The patio door was cracked open. He was probably talking to one of his friends. She kicked off her heels near the entryway and started toward the kitchen. Then she heard him laugh, and stopped. Not because the laugh was suspicious, because it wasn't familiar. At least not completely. It sounded younger somehow, lighter, like a version of Johnson she hadn't heard in years. She stood still for a moment, listening without meaning to. Johnson said something she couldn't quite make out. A woman laughed. The sound traveled clearly through the open patio door. Sheila frowned. The voice wasn't familiar. One of his cousins, maybe. A coworker. Someone's wife. She started walking again. Then Johnson spoke. Just a few more weeks. She stopped. The woman laughed. Seriously? Yeah. His voice sounded relaxed, happy. You'll see. Sheila felt her grip tighten slightly around the suitcase handle. Not panic. Not yet. Mostly confusion. The conversation continued. Fragments drifting through the doorway. Then came the sentence. The one she would remember years later, with perfect clarity. Once the divorce is done, we won't have to hide anymore. Everything inside the house seemed to go silent. The refrigerator, the air conditioner, the faint ticking clock near the kitchen, all of it disappeared. For a second, Sheila honestly wondered whether she'd misunderstood. Divorce? Hide? Maybe she missed context. Maybe she walked into the middle of a conversation. Maybe. Then the woman laughed again, excited, nervous. The kind of laugh people have when they're talking about a future they're looking forward to. And suddenly, there wasn't much room for misunderstanding anymore. Sheila didn't move, didn't make a sound. Outside, Johnson kept talking, completely unaware she was standing 10 feet away. The woman asked something. Sheila couldn't hear it clearly. Then she caught 2 words, lake house. Her stomach dropped. Johnson laughed. The lake house is nothing. Nothing. The property was worth nearly $4 million. Sheila owned it outright. The woman sounded amazed. Oh my God. Trust me, Johnson said. We're going to be more than fine. The certainty in his voice was what stayed with her. Not the affair, not even the lies. The certainty. He didn't sound worried. He didn't sound conflicted. He sounded like someone discussing vacation plans, like someone describing a future that was already guaranteed. Then came one final sentence. The hard part is almost over. The hard part, 15 years together, reduced to an inconvenience. A waiting period, a hurdle. Sheila stared at the kitchen floor, the suitcase still in her hand, and something unexpected happened. She didn't cry. She didn't feel angry, not immediately. Mostly she felt disconnected, like she was listening to a conversation about someone else's marriage, someone else's husband, someone else's life. After another minute, she turned around, slowly, carefully, and walked upstairs. No confrontation, no dramatic entrance onto the patio, no questions, nothing. By the time she reached the bedroom, her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it. She changed clothes, washed her face, sat on the edge of the bed, then waited. A few minutes later, she heard the patio door close downstairs. Footsteps, the sound of Johnson moving through the house, normal sounds, ordinary sounds, the kind she'd heard thousands of times before. Eventually, the bedroom door opened. Johnson stepped inside. He looked surprised. "Oh." She glanced up from her phone. "You got back. Flight was delayed." "That sucks." "Yeah." He disappeared into the bathroom. A minute later, she heard running water, then cabinet doors, then silence. The routine continued exactly as it always had, and somehow that made everything worse, because nothing about him suggested guilt. Nothing suggested fear. Nothing suggested a man whose wife had almost overheard the future he was planning without her. A little later, he climbed into bed, said goodnight, turned off the lamp, and within minutes, he was asleep. Sheila wasn't. She stared into the darkness, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. For years, she'd believed she knew exactly who was lying beside her. Now, she wasn't sure, and somewhere between midnight and sunrise, she made a decision that would change everything that happened next. Johnson would never know she heard that phone call. Not yet, because for the first time in a very long time, Sheila wanted answers more than she wanted a confrontation. And Johnson had absolutely no idea the clock had already started. The next morning felt almost normal. That was the disturbing part. Johnson came downstairs around 7, poured coffee, checked his phone, complained about traffic, asked Sheila if she wanted breakfast, the same routine they'd followed for years. If someone had walked through the kitchen, they would have seen an ordinary married couple starting an ordinary day. Only one of them knew the marriage was already over. Sheila watched him spread butter across a piece of toast, watched him laugh at something on his phone, watched him move through the morning exactly as he always had. And for the first time, she realized how easy it was to hide things when nobody knew they should be looking. A few days later, she started noticing details. Not intentionally. The details simply stood out now. A dinner receipt from a restaurant they'd never visited together. A hotel charge that didn't match any trip she knew about. A new watch. An expensive one, the kind of purchase people usually mention. One evening she caught sight of it while they were eating dinner. She nodded toward his wrist. "New?" Johnson glanced down. "Oh." The answer came too quickly. "Yeah." "Nice." He smiled. "Thanks." Then he changed the subject. That was becoming a habit. Questions entered the room. Answers never stayed long. A week later, another odd moment happened. They were attending a neighborhood gathering. Nothing formal, just drinks and conversation. At one point, one of the neighbors joked about retirement. Everyone laughed. Then Johnson raised his glass. "Trust me, things work out." A few people smiled. One man laughed. "You sound confident." Johnson grinned. "I've got reasons." The comment lasted 2 seconds. Then the conversation moved on. Nobody thought anything of it, except Sheila, because she knew exactly what those reasons were, or at least what he believed they were. On the drive home, she looked out the passenger window. Johnson was humming along to the radio, relaxed, content, the same man she'd overheard on the patio. The same certainty. At a red light, he glanced over. What? She hadn't realized she'd been staring. Nothing. "You sure?" "Yeah." The light turned green. The conversation ended, but a question remained. How long had he been planning this? Months? Years? The answer came unexpectedly. About 3 weeks later, a friend of theirs hosted a birthday dinner at a steakhouse in Atlanta. Around 15 people showed up, most of them familiar faces, business owners, developers, couples they'd known for years. Halfway through the evening, someone mentioned a new luxury community being built north of the city. A large project, high profile, the type of thing people talked about. One guest turned toward Sheila. "You looked at that site a few years ago, didn't you?" Before she could answer, Johnson jumped in. "We passed on it." The table nodded. Conversation continued. Then someone asked why. Again, Johnson answered. The numbers didn't make sense. Sheila sat quietly, listening, watching, because that wasn't what happened. Not even close. She'd passed on the project because environmental reviews revealed massive infrastructure costs. She remembered the meetings, the reports, the financial models. Johnson hadn't attended a single one, yet he was telling the story like he'd been sitting beside her the entire time. Nobody challenged him. Why would they? He sounded confident. The problem was that confidence and accuracy aren't always the same thing. Later that evening, while people gathered near the valet stand, an investor approached Sheila privately, an older man she'd worked with for years. He smiled politely, then lowered his voice. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." He hesitated. "Does Johnson work with you more than I realize?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" The investor looked uncomfortable. "Nothing bad." He paused. "It's just, whenever people ask about projects, he talks like he's running them." For a moment, neither spoke. The investor immediately regretted bringing it up. "I shouldn't have said anything." "No." She smiled politely. "It's okay." The man nodded and walked away. Sheila stood there for a few seconds longer, not upset, not surprised, mostly because hearing it from someone else made something click. For years, she'd assumed she was imagining it, overthinking it. Now she wasn't so sure, because it wasn't only happening around her. Other people were noticing it too. The pattern was becoming visible, and once a pattern becomes visible, it's hard to stop seeing it. That realization followed her home, followed her through meetings, followed her through quiet evenings, sitting across from Johnson at dinner. The more she watched, the more she noticed. Not lies exactly, assumptions, claims, small adjustments to reality, each one harmless on its own. Together, something else entirely. And somewhere beneath all of it sat the same unsettling truth. Johnson wasn't acting like a man preparing to leave a marriage. He was acting like a man preparing to collect a reward. The problem was that he seemed completely convinced the reward already belonged to him. The charity gala took place about a month later. Every major city seems to have events like it. Expensive tickets, formal attire, silent auctions, networking disguised as philanthropy. For Sheila, it was part of the job. For Johnson, it was one of his favorite environments. A room full of successful people, conversations, introductions, attention. He thrived in those spaces. The ballroom was already crowded when they arrived. Investors, developers, attorneys, bankers, most of them familiar. Many of them had worked with Sheila for years. The evening started normally. Cocktails, small talk, handshakes, nothing unusual. Then dinner began, and halfway through the meal, an investor seated across from them smiled at Sheila. "I heard about the acquisition." She smiled. "Which one?" The investor laughed. "Fair point." A few people around the table chuckled. "The retail portfolio." "Oh." She nodded. "That one." Before she could continue, Johnson jumped in. Honestly, she almost didn't do it. The investor looked surprised. "Really?" Johnson took a sip of wine. "She worries too much." A few smiles appeared around the table. Polite smiles, the kind people use when they're deciding whether something was meant as a joke. Sheila remained quiet. The investor glanced toward her. "You worried about what?" She opened her mouth. Johnson answered first. "Everything." Several people laughed politely. Again, the conversation could have ended there. It should have. Instead, Johnson leaned back in his chair. I keep telling her not everything needs a 50-page analysis. Silence. Not complete silence, but enough. The investor lowered his glass. Someone across the table adjusted in their seat. A woman seated beside Sheila looked down at her plate. The atmosphere shifted, only slightly, but noticeably, because everyone sitting there knew something Johnson apparently didn't. The acquisition had been a major success, and it had been successful because Sheila spent months analyzing it. One developer attempted to rescue the conversation. That's probably why she's one of the smartest people in the industry. A few heads nodded. Johnson smiled, then made it worse. Or maybe some of us just know how to take risks. The silence that followed lasted longer. Nobody argued. Nobody challenged him. But something changed around the table. People stopped laughing. People stopped encouraging the conversation. And for the first time all evening, Johnson seemed completely unaware of the room. The investor eventually changed the subject. Market conditions, interest rates, safer territory. The dinner moved forward, but the moment lingered, not because it was dramatic, because it was revealing. Later that evening, guests gathered near the ballroom entrance. Before leaving, clusters of conversations formed around the room. Sheila was speaking with a lender when a woman she'd known for years approached. After a few minutes of casual conversation, the woman gently touched her arm. "You okay?" The question surprised her. "Why?" The woman hesitated, then smiled awkwardly. "Nothing." Which meant something, because people rarely ask that question for no reason. Sheila glanced across the room. Johnson was standing with a group of developers, laughing, talking, looking perfectly comfortable. For a moment, she understood exactly what everyone else had seen during dinner. Not arrogance. Something stranger. Johnson genuinely believed what he was saying. That was the unsettling part. The certainty, the complete lack of self-awareness. The event ended shortly afterward. They walked through the parking garage toward the car. The sound of their footsteps echoed off concrete walls. Johnson loosened his tie. "Good crowd tonight." "Yeah." "You've been quiet." She unlocked the car. "I'm tired." He nodded. That seemed to satisfy him. Once they were on the highway, Johnson turned on the radio. For several miles, neither spoke. Then he suddenly laughed. "What?" She glanced over, the look on that guy's face. "What guy?" "The investor." He shook his head. "People take this stuff too seriously." Sheila watched the road ahead, streetlights flashing across the windshield. Then she asked a simple question. "What stuff?" Johnson shrugged. "Business." That answer stayed in the air. Business. The thing she'd spent years building. The thing supporting their entire lifestyle. The thing funding every vacation, every property, every luxury he'd come to expect. Business. As if it were some game people were overcomplicating. As if success happened because someone felt confident enough. She looked back out the windshield, and for the first time, a thought crossed her mind that she couldn't ignore. Johnson didn't merely misunderstand what she did. He didn't merely underestimate it. He genuinely believed he understood success better than she did. The realization landed quietly, but once it arrived, it refused to leave. Because if that was true, then the problem wasn't the affair. The problem wasn't Rachel. The problem was much deeper. Johnson wasn't preparing for reality. He was preparing for a future built entirely on his own version of it. And sooner or later, reality was going to have something to say about that. The call came on a Tuesday. Nothing about the day felt unusual. Sheila had spent most of the morning moving between meetings. One investor call, 2 site reviews, a budget discussion that lasted longer than it should have. Normal work, normal problems, the kind she knew how to solve. She was walking toward another conference room when her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen. David Mercer, a banker she'd worked with for nearly 7 years. David wasn't the type of person who called unexpectedly, especially not during business hours. That alone got her attention. She stepped into an empty office and answered, "David, hey." His voice sounded hesitant, already unusual. "You busy?" "A little." A brief pause. "Do you have a minute?" She closed the door. "What's going on?" Another pause, longer this time. Then David sighed. "This is awkward." She sat down. "You're making me nervous." "I probably should." Now she was fully paying attention. David wasn't dramatic. If anything, he was known for being calm, methodical, predictable. The fact that he sounded uncomfortable meant something. Finally, he spoke. "Johnson's been approaching lenders." For a second, Sheila said nothing, not because she was surprised, because she wanted him to continue. "What kind of lenders?" "Private lenders." The answer came immediately, then another, and a couple traditional institutions. She frowned. "For what?" David hesitated. "Large personal loans." The room suddenly felt smaller. She leaned back in her chair. "How large?" Another pause. "Large enough that people started asking questions." That wasn't good. Not because of the number, because of the attention. Attention usually meant documentation, verification, proof, things that had a habit of exposing assumptions. Sheila stared through the office window. Employees moved through the hallway outside, life continuing as normal. Meanwhile, the conversation was becoming increasingly strange. What exactly is he telling them? David exhaled slowly. He seems to believe he's about to receive significant assets. There it was, not suspicion, confirmation. For months she'd sensed it. Now she was hearing it from someone else. Someone with no reason to exaggerate. She rubbed her forehead. "What assets?" David laughed once, not because anything was funny, because he already knew the answer. "That's what concerns me." The silence stretched. Then he asked carefully, "Does he actually have access to those assets?" "No." The answer came immediately. Firm, certain. "No." David didn't sound surprised. "I didn't think so." Neither spoke for several seconds. Then he added something that stayed with her. "The problem isn't the loan requests." "What is it?" "He sounds convinced." The sentence landed harder than expected, because that was exactly what she'd been seeing. Not a man hoping for something, not a man guessing. "A man convinced," David continued. "Usually when people talk about future settlements, there's uncertainty." "And him?" "No uncertainty." The answer was immediate. "He talks like it's already done." After the call ended, Sheila remained seated for several minutes, thinking, not about the affair, not about Rachel, about confidence, specifically misplaced confidence, because she'd spent months assuming Johnson was lying. Now she wasn't sure that was the whole story. The more information surfaced, the more another possibility emerged. Johnson believed it, actually believed it, and somehow that made everything worse. Later that evening she came home and found him sitting at the kitchen island, laptop open, several luxury property listings displayed across the screen. She stopped, not because she was shocked, because the timing felt almost absurd. Johnson looked up. Hey. He turned the screen toward her. "Look at this place." A waterfront property appeared, massive, expensive, completely unrealistic. Johnson smiled. "Pretty incredible." She studied the listing, then looked back at him. "You planning on buying it?" He laughed. "Not tomorrow." Not tomorrow. The answer wasn't a joke. It was a timeline, a plan, a future. She could hear it. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Johnson closed the laptop, and the conversation ended. But the image stayed with her, because suddenly, everything connected. The watch, the new clothes, the confidence, the future plans, the property listings, the banker call. Johnson wasn't preparing for life after divorce. He was spending money that didn't exist yet, making plans for wealth he didn't have, building a future on assumptions he'd never bothered verifying. And that was when the emotional center of the story shifted. Up until then, Sheila had viewed the affair as the problem. Now she realized it was only part of the problem. The bigger issue was the fantasy, the story Johnson had been telling himself, a story that was becoming more expensive by the day. And like most fantasies, it was about to collide with facts. The collision wouldn't happen immediately, but it was coming, because somewhere out there was a woman named Rachel, a woman planning vacations, looking at houses, imagining a future, and she believed the exact same story Johnson believed, which meant two people were now building their lives around the same illusion, an illusion that reality was getting closer and closer to destroying. The first time Sheila heard Rachel's name, it wasn't from Johnson, It wasn't from a private investigator. It wasn't from a lawyer. It came from someone who had no idea they were revealing anything, which somehow made it worse. The conversation happened during lunch with a longtime colleague, one of those casual business lunches that drift from work to gossip and back again. They were halfway through discussing a commercial project when the woman suddenly paused, then frowned. "You know, I've been meaning to ask you something." Sheila looked up from her salad. "What's that?" The woman hesitated, immediately uncomfortable. The kind of hesitation people have when they realize they're standing near information they shouldn't have. "Actually, never mind." Now Sheila was curious. "What?" The woman shifted in her chair. "Who's Rachel?" For a moment, the restaurant noise seemed to fade. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough that Sheila noticed. "Why?" she asked. The woman blinked, and in that instant, she knew. "Oh." The color left her face. "You don't know." Sheila didn't answer. The woman immediately looked miserable. The next few minutes were awkward for both of them, not because the woman had malicious intentions, because she'd accidentally stepped into a situation she didn't understand. Eventually, pieces began emerging. Nothing explosive, nothing definitive, just comments, observations, things people had heard, and every piece pointed toward the same strange conclusion. Rachel thought Johnson was the successful real estate developer, not connected to one, not married to one, actually one. At first, Sheila assumed there had been a misunderstanding. There wasn't. Over the following weeks, more information surfaced, not because she went looking for it, because social circles overlap, people talk, especially when they think they're discussing public information. One acquaintance mentioned seeing Johnson and Rachel together at an event. Another described a dinner conversation. A third shared a story that stopped Sheila cold. Apparently, Rachel had spent 20 minutes discussing future development projects. Projects she believed Johnson would be leading. The acquaintance laughed while telling the story. Honestly, she sounded proud. Proud. The word stayed with Sheila, because suddenly she could picture the conversations, the promises, the stories, everything Johnson must have been saying. And the more she learned, the less angry she felt toward Rachel, because Rachel wasn't seeing reality either. She was seeing a character, a version of Johnson that existed mostly in his own imagination. A few weeks later, another story reached her. This one came from a developer she'd known for years. The man called, mostly to discuss business. The Rachel story surfaced accidentally. "Oh, by the way." His voice sounded amused. "I met your husband's friend." Sheila already knew who he meant. "Rachel?" "That's the one." He laughed, then added, "She's got big plans." Something about his tone made Sheila ask, "What kind of plans?" The developer chuckled. "You'll love this." That usually meant she wouldn't. Apparently, she's redesigning the lake house. For a moment, Sheila honestly thought she'd misheard him. The what? The lake house. The developer laughed again. She had ideas for the dock. Guest house, too. Silence. Then, interesting. The developer kept talking, but Sheila barely heard the rest, because all she could think about was the certainty required for that conversation to happen. Rachel wasn't guessing. She wasn't hoping. She believed, completely. Somewhere, Johnson had apparently described a future where the lake house belonged to them. The same lake house he'd casually dismissed during the patio phone call. The same lake house he didn't own. The same lake house he could never legally promise to anyone. That was the moment something finally became clear. Rachel wasn't participating in a secret affair, at least not emotionally. Rachel was participating in a future she'd been sold, a future filled with properties, developments, luxury homes, investments, success. And if she believed all of that, then Johnson must have been presenting himself as the architect behind it all, the builder, the visionary, the man responsible. The deeper Sheila looked, the stranger it became, because Rachel wasn't the only one believing the story. Johnson believed it too. That's what made the situation dangerous. People can abandon a lie. It's much harder to abandon a belief. One evening, Sheila sat alone in her office reviewing project reports. The room was quiet. Outside, construction crews were finishing work for the day. Inside, she found herself staring at a development rendering without really seeing it, because a question kept returning. How long had this been happening? Not the affair. The story. How long had Johnson been rewriting reality? Months? Years? Had it started when he began saying, "our projects"? Had it started when people confused proximity with ownership? Or had it started even earlier? The answer almost didn't matter anymore, because whatever fantasy Johnson had created, it was growing, and now Rachel was helping him build it. The problem was that fantasies can survive almost anything except facts, and facts were getting closer every day. Sooner or later, Rachel was going to discover the same thing Johnson was discovering. The empire she'd been promised wasn't waiting for her. It never existed in the first place. The family dinner happened 3 weeks later, and if anyone had told Sheila beforehand that it would become one of the most revealing nights of the entire divorce, she would have laughed, because nothing about it seemed important. It was just Sunday dinner, the kind of gathering families have all the time. Johnson's mother cooked. Everyone showed up. People ate too much, talked too loudly, and usually left carrying leftovers. Simple, predictable, normal. At least that's how it started. By the time Sheila and Johnson arrived, most of the family was already there. His parents, a couple cousins, his younger brother, Mark. Everyone gathered around the kitchen island while dinner finished cooking. For a while, the conversation stayed light. Football, weather, travel plans, the usual subjects. Then someone asked Mark how things were going. The mood shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough. Mark forced a smile. Getting there. Everyone knew what that meant. 3 months earlier, Mark had lost his job during a corporate restructuring. He'd been searching ever since, applying everywhere, interviewing constantly, working harder than most people realized. The situation wasn't hopeless, but it wasn't easy either. Johnson's mother touched Mark's arm. "Something will come." Mark nodded. "I know." The conversation could have ended there. Probably should have. Instead, Johnson jumped in. "You know what your problem is?" Several heads turned. Mark looked up. "My problem?" "You're overthinking everything." Silence. Not uncomfortable yet, just unexpected. Mark laughed lightly. "What does that mean?" Johnson leaned back in his chair. "It means people spend too much time planning." There it was again. The same speech, the same philosophy, the same certainty. Mark stared at him. "I'm unemployed." "I'm serious." "So am I." A few people smiled awkwardly, trying to keep things light. Johnson kept going. "You've got to trust yourself." Mark put down his fork. "Trust myself to do what?" "Take risks." The room became noticeably quieter. Across the table, Johnson's father suddenly seemed very interested in his mashed potatoes. His mother stopped smiling. Everyone could feel it now. The conversation wasn't helping. Mark wasn't being lazy. Everyone knew that. He'd been sending applications every day, taking interviews, following leads, doing everything he could. Everyone knew it, except Johnson. "You make it sound simple," Mark said. "It is simple." That answer landed badly. You could feel it. Even Johnson's cousins exchanged glances. Because life wasn't simple. Job loss wasn't simple. Bills weren't simple. Reality wasn't simple. Yet Johnson spoke as though confidence alone solved everything. Then he made the mistake, the one that changed the room. He looked toward Sheila, only briefly, then said, "Some people spend their whole lives planning." The table went silent, not because nobody understood, because everyone did. The implication wasn't subtle. Johnson continued, "Other people actually know when to move." Nobody laughed. Nobody responded. The room felt frozen. Mark stared at his plate. Johnson's mother looked disappointed. His father looked exhausted. And for the first time all evening, Johnson seemed unaware of how he sounded. Or maybe he simply didn't care. Then Sheila placed her fork down. The sound was small, but everyone heard it. She looked directly at him, calm, expressionless. "Are you finished?" The room went completely still. Johnson blinked. "What?" Her voice never changed. "Are you finished?" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Several seconds passed. Long enough to become uncomfortable. Long enough for everyone to realize what was happening. For the first time all night, Johnson looked uncertain. Not angry. Not confident. Uncertain. Because Sheila hadn't argued. Hadn't defended herself. Hadn't created a scene, she'd simply forced him to hear himself. And suddenly there was nowhere to hide. The silence stretched. Then Sheila stood, "Excuse me," and walked toward the back porch. No drama, no slammed doors, no raised voices, just quiet. The sliding door closed behind her. Outside, the evening air felt cool. The neighborhood was peaceful. Crickets humming in the distance. For several minutes, she stood alone, listening to the silence. Then the door opened again. She expected Johnson. Instead, it was his mother. The older woman stepped onto the porch and joined her at the railing. Neither spoke immediately. They simply stood there, looking out across the backyard. Eventually his mother sighed. A tired sigh, the kind that carries years inside it. That wasn't necessary. Sheila glanced over. His mother wasn't looking at her. She was looking at the yard, but they both knew who she meant. No. Sheila nodded. It wasn't. Another silence followed. Then his mother quietly said something Sheila would remember for a long time. "He's gotten very comfortable lately." The statement hung in the air. Not an accusation, not even criticism, just an observation, a truthful one. For the first time, Sheila realized she wasn't the only person noticing the change. Other people saw it too. Maybe they'd been seeing it longer than she had. A few minutes later, they returned inside. The conversation had moved on. Safer topics, holiday plans, sports, anything except what had just happened. But the atmosphere never fully recovered, and neither did Johnson. For the rest of the evening, he barely spoke. Not because someone argued with him, because nobody did. Sometimes silence says more than confrontation ever could. The drive home felt unusually long. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. Johnson kept both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Finally, halfway home, he spoke. "You embarrassed me." She almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because after everything that happened, that was what bothered him. His embarrassment, not Mark, not his mother, not what he'd actually said. His embarrassment. She looked out the passenger window, then quietly replied, "You should think about that." Johnson frowned. "What does that mean?" But Sheila didn't answer, because for the first time, she wasn't interested in explaining things to him anymore. And for the first time in a very long time, Johnson had started running into something his confidence couldn't solve. Other people. People who were no longer willing to pretend they didn't see what was happening. The problem was that family disappointment was only the beginning, because the next phase wouldn't involve opinions, or awkward dinners, or uncomfortable silences. The next phase would involve attorneys, financial disclosures, and facts were much harder to ignore. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday morning, not by surprise, not after a huge argument, not after some dramatic confrontation. By the time they appeared, both Sheila and Johnson knew exactly where things were heading. Still, there was something strange about seeing 15 years reduced to a stack of legal documents. Pages, signatures, deadlines, instructions, the end of a marriage, printed in black ink. Sheila reviewed everything with her attorney that afternoon. The meeting lasted less than an hour. Professional, efficient, exactly the way she wanted it. When they finished reviewing the paperwork, her attorney leaned back in his chair. "How do you want to handle this?" Sheila didn't need time to think. "Professionally." The attorney nodded, almost relieved, because divorce often turns intelligent people into strangers. She'd seen it happen. He'd seen it happen. Everyone had, but that wasn't what she wanted. There would be no revenge, no public humiliation, no attempts to destroy each other, just facts, and whatever those facts revealed. Meanwhile, Johnson seemed happier than he'd been in months. That was what bothered her most, not the filing itself, the excitement, the visible excitement. 3 days after the papers were filed, Sheila came downstairs early one morning and found him sitting at the kitchen island, laptop open, coffee beside him, smiling. He quickly rotated the screen when he noticed her. "Look at this." She walked over. A luxury waterfront home filled the display. Floor-to-ceiling windows, private dock, guest house, everything Rachel would probably love. Johnson leaned back. "Beautiful, right?" She looked at the price, then at him. "Very. What do you think?" The question hung in the air. For a moment she wasn't sure whether he was joking. Then she realized he wasn't. He was imagining it. Actually imagining it. The house, the lifestyle, the future, everything. And somehow he still looked completely certain. She nodded politely, then headed upstairs, because there was nothing left to say. A few weeks later, she heard another story. Then another, then another. Rachel was apparently talking openly about future plans, vacations, properties, travel. Someone even mentioned she'd been discussing design ideas for a future home. Every story sounded the same. Not hope, expectation, as though the future had already been delivered, as though lawyers and courts were merely handling paperwork. The more Sheila heard, the more surreal it became, because she understood something neither of them seemed willing to consider. Nothing had actually happened yet. No settlement, no decisions, no outcomes, only assumptions. Yet somehow those assumptions had become plans. One afternoon, shortly after filing, Sheila attended a routine legal meeting. Nothing dramatic, just financial disclosures, asset inventories, ownership records, the kind of documents most people never think about, until suddenly they become very important. Her attorney slid a thick folder across the conference table. This is where things usually get interesting. She opened it. Pages and pages of information, documentation, verification, facts. The word lingered in her mind. Facts, because facts were about to enter a story built almost entirely on assumptions. Over the next hour, they reviewed structures she'd spent years creating. Operating agreements, holding companies, investment entities, ownership arrangements. Nothing new, at least not to her. She'd helped build every one of them. Yet as the meeting continued, she found herself thinking about Johnson. Specifically, how many times he'd left the room when these topics came up. How many times he'd changed the subject. How many times he'd joked about lawyers making things complicated. The details had bored him. Now those same details were about to become the most important part of the divorce. That realization stayed with her long after the meeting ended, because for years, Johnson had dismissed the process, the planning, the structure, the discipline, all the invisible work supporting visible success. Now reality was preparing to show him exactly what all that work had created, and reality was rarely interested in people's assumptions. A month later, the first financial reviews began. Neither side could avoid them. The process demanded transparency, documentation, proof. The fantasy stage was ending. The fact stage was beginning, and almost immediately, cracks started appearing. Nothing public, nothing dramatic, just questions. Questions that suddenly didn't have easy answers. Questions about ownership. Questions about assets. Questions about expectations. One evening, Sheila arrived home and found Johnson sitting alone on the patio. The same patio, the same place where she'd overheard the phone call months earlier. He was staring at his laptop screen. Not smiling this time, not relaxed, just staring. For the first time in nearly a year, he looked uncertain. The sight caught her attention, because uncertainty looked strange on him, almost unfamiliar. She stood inside the kitchen for a moment, watching through the glass, then quietly walked away. No conversation, no confrontation, just observation, because she already knew something Johnson was only beginning to discover. The future he'd been planning for and the future that actually existed were not the same thing, and very soon that difference was going to become impossible to ignore. For him, for Rachel, for everyone, because the paperwork was finally speaking, and paperwork tends to be much harder to argue with than people. The first crack appeared during a meeting Johnson almost didn't attend. By then, several weeks had passed since the divorce filing. The confidence was still there, mostly, at least on the surface, but underneath it, questions had started appearing. Questions he didn't like, questions he couldn't charm away, questions that required actual answers. This particular meeting took place in a downtown Atlanta law office. Nothing glamorous. A conference table, several folders, a few attorneys, the kind of room where reality tends to become unavoidable. Johnson arrived expecting another routine review, more paperwork, more signatures, more waiting. Instead, within 20 minutes, He found himself staring at a document he didn't understand. One of the attorneys pointed toward a section. "Can you explain your ownership position here?" Johnson glanced down. The company name looked familiar, very familiar. He'd heard it discussed for years, seen it mentioned in meetings, watched it appear on reports. Yet, when he opened his mouth to answer, nothing came out. The attorney waited. "What percentage do you own?" Johnson frowned. The answer should have been simple. It wasn't, because for the first time he realized he didn't actually know. The attorney nodded slowly, then moved on. The next document, the next entity, the next property, the next question. Again and again, the same pattern emerged. Johnson recognized the names, recognized the projects, recognized the assets, but recognition wasn't ownership, and ownership was what mattered now. Not assumptions, not memories, ownership. The meeting ended 2 hours later. Johnson left with a folder under his arm and a growing feeling in his stomach he couldn't quite explain. For years, he'd spoken about these properties as though they were part of his life. Now he was discovering that being near something wasn't the same as possessing it. A few days later, another problem surfaced. One of the private lenders he'd approached requested updated financial verification. The request itself wasn't unusual. What followed was, because suddenly, projections weren't enough, promises weren't enough, future expectations weren't enough. The lender wanted documentation, proof, and proof was becoming difficult to provide. The response came less than a week later. The financing discussion was paused, officially temporary, unofficially finished. Johnson stared at the email for nearly 10 minutes, reading the same paragraph repeatedly, trying to find a different meaning hidden somewhere between the lines. There wasn't one. The answer was simple. No. For the first time, panic started replacing confidence. Not publicly, not yet, but internally. The shift had begun. Around the same time, Rachel started asking more questions. The first one came during dinner. According to someone who overheard part of the conversation, she sounded excited. She'd apparently found another property online, one she wanted Johnson to see. After showing him photos, she smiled. "So what's the timeline now?" The question seemed harmless, but Johnson hesitated, only for a second. Still, Rachel noticed. People always notice hesitation from someone who usually has answers. "What do you mean?" she asked. Johnson forced a smile. "I'm just waiting on a few things." "What things?" Another hesitation, longer this time. Rachel's smile faded slightly. Not completely, just enough. The conversation moved on, but something had changed. For the first time, uncertainty entered a future that had always sounded guaranteed. Meanwhile, Sheila continued moving through the process exactly as she'd promised. Professionally, no surprises, no emotional outbursts, no attempts to manipulate the outcome. Her attorneys requested information. She provided it. Meetings happened. She attended them. Life continued. The difference was becoming impossible to ignore. While Johnson spent months imagining outcomes, Sheila spent years preparing for them, and preparation was beginning to matter. One afternoon, Johnson sat alone in his apartment reviewing paperwork. The stack beside him seemed endless. Trust documents, ownership records, operating agreements, financial statements, the same documents he'd ignored for years, the same documents he'd joked about, the same documents he'd never bothered reading. Now they were all he could think about. At one point, he dropped the papers onto the table and leaned back, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how everything felt so different from what he'd expected, because the future he'd imagined had seemed obvious, certain, almost inevitable. Yet every document told a different story. Every meeting told a different story. Every attorney told a different story. And for the first time, Johnson found himself confronting a possibility he'd spent years avoiding. What if he'd been wrong? Not slightly wrong, completely wrong. The thought refused to leave, because once a fantasy starts breaking apart, every crack reveals another one underneath. And this fantasy was cracking everywhere. The lenders saw it. The attorneys saw it. Soon Rachel would see it too. The only person still trying not to see it was Johnson. But reality was running out of patience, and the next meeting would force him to confront something he'd spent years assuming The truth about the fortune he thought was waiting for him. The meeting lasted less than 90 minutes. Yet by the time it ended, Johnson's entire future looked different. It wasn't because someone yelled, nobody did. It wasn't because anyone embarrassed him. Nobody tried. The damage came from something much simpler. Facts. Cold, documented, verifiable facts. Johnson sat across from his attorney, while several financial documents lay spread across the conference table. Pages he'd already reviewed. Pages he thought he understood. Pages that somehow seemed to say something different every time he looked at them. His attorney tapped one section, then another, patiently walking him through the same explanation he'd apparently been trying to give for weeks. Finally, Johnson interrupted. Okay. The attorney looked up. Okay? What does all this actually mean? The attorney leaned back. For a moment, he looked almost sympathetic. Then he answered. It means being married to someone who owns assets isn't the same thing as owning them yourself. The room went quiet. Johnson stared at him, waiting, expecting more, some clarification, some exception, some technicality. Instead, the attorney continued. Most of these assets were protected years ago. The properties? Protected. The developments? Protected. The investment entities? Protected. Each answer landed like a small hammer. Not dramatic, just relentless. One fact after another, Johnson looked back down at the paperwork. The words blurred slightly, not because they were complicated, because suddenly he remembered things, conversations, meetings, moments he'd ignored. Years earlier, Sheila had tried explaining ownership structures over dinner. He'd changed the subject. Another time, she'd invited him to attend a legal review meeting. He'd declined. A golf tournament sounded more interesting. A few years later, she'd spent half an hour discussing a new investment structure. He remembered laughing, telling her she sounded like an accountant. At the time, it seemed harmless. Now those memories felt different, because the details he'd dismissed had quietly shaped reality, and reality was now shaping him. The attorney continued explaining, but Johnson barely heard him, because a realization had started forming, not all at once, slowly, painfully. He'd spent years assuming proximity meant participation. That standing beside success made him part of it. That being married to the builder somehow made him a builder too. The paperwork disagreed. Completely. When the meeting finally ended, Johnson walked outside and sat in his car without starting the engine. People moved along the sidewalk. Traffic flowed through downtown Atlanta. Life continued. Meanwhile, he sat there staring through the windshield, trying to understand how he had gotten it so wrong. Not partially wrong, completely wrong. For months he'd imagined a specific future. The houses, the investments, the opportunities, the lifestyle. Now every piece of that future seemed to be disappearing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. A week later, another lender ended discussions. The email arrived shortly after noon. Short, professional, final. After reviewing updated information, they would not be moving forward. Johnson read it 3 times. Then a 4th. The answer never changed. By then, the financial consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. Plans he'd made months earlier suddenly looked consequences were becoming impossible to ignore. Plans he'd made months earlier suddenly looked reckless. Purchases looked reckless. Assumptions looked reckless. Everything had been built on an outcome he'd never verified. And now that outcome was collapsing. Around the same time, Rachel's questions became more frequent. At first, she tried to sound casual. Any updates? What are the attorneys saying? How much longer? But underneath the questions sat something new. Concern. The certainty she'd carried for months was beginning to crack. One evening, they met for dinner at a restaurant outside Atlanta, the same place they'd visited several times before. The atmosphere felt different immediately. Rachel arrived excited, as usual. She opened her phone and slid it across the table. I found another one. Johnson looked down. A luxury property. Beautiful. Expensive. Exactly the kind of place they'd been discussing for months. Rachel smiled. What do you think? Normally he would have answered immediately. This time, he didn't. The hesitation lasted only a few seconds. But Rachel noticed. Her smile faded slightly. What? Johnson looked away. Nothing. Johnson, the excitement in her voice had disappeared. Now there was only curiosity and concern. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Rachel asked the question she'd apparently been avoiding. "Is everything okay?" Johnson forced a smile. "Of course." But the answer sounded different now, less convincing, less certain. Rachel stared at him, trying to understand, trying to connect pieces, the same way Sheila had months earlier. The difference was that Rachel had far less information, at least for now. The dinner continued, technically, but the energy never returned. The future they usually talked about remained untouched. Neither seemed eager to discuss it, because for the first time, reality had entered the conversation, and reality wasn't supporting the story anymore. Later that night, after returning home, Johnson sat alone in his apartment. The television played quietly in the background, unwatched. A stack of documents sat on the coffee table. He looked at them, then looked away, then looked back again, because the truth was becoming impossible to escape. The fortune he'd been planning around wasn't waiting for him. The empire he'd described to Rachel wasn't waiting for him. The future he'd promised both of them wasn't waiting for him. And deep down, he finally knew it. The problem was that Rachel didn't know it yet. Not completely, but she was getting closer. And once she discovered the truth, the relationship wouldn't survive it. Because Rachel hadn't fallen in love with uncertainty. She'd fallen in love with a future, and that future was disappearing one document at a time. Rachel discovered the truth the same way most people do, not through one big revelation, through 100 small inconsistencies that eventually become impossible to ignore. At first, she tried to explain them away. The delayed answers, the changing timelines, the sudden uncertainty. The way Johnson no longer sounded like a man describing a guaranteed future. A few months earlier, every conversation had ended with confidence. Now, every conversation seemed to end with waiting. Waiting for paperwork, waiting for attorneys, waiting for clarification, waiting for answers. The change was impossible to miss. One Friday evening, Rachel called him. At first, the conversation sounded normal. They talked about work, weekend plans, a restaurant they'd been meaning to try. Then she asked a simple question. "Have you heard anything new?" Johnson knew exactly what she meant. He stared out the window of his apartment, the city lights reflecting across the glass. Not yet. A pause. Not yet? Things take time. Rachel was quiet, long enough that he looked at the phone to make sure the call hadn't disconnected. Then she asked, "How much time?" The question hung between them. Johnson didn't answer immediately, because he didn't know. For the first time, he genuinely didn't know. Rachel noticed. Of course she noticed. People notice uncertainty most when it comes from someone who used to be certain. The conversation ended shortly afterward. Nothing dramatic, nothing hostile, but something had changed. And both of them felt it. Over the following weeks, the distance grew. Calls became shorter. Messages became less frequent. Plans became harder to make. The future they once discussed constantly seemed to disappear from conversations altogether. Neither mentioned it. Neither needed to. The absence said enough. Then came the question that changed everything. According to a mutual acquaintance, Rachel asked it during dinner one evening. A direct question. A simple one. One she'd apparently avoided asking for months. How much of it is actually yours? Johnson later claimed he didn't know how to answer. Maybe that was true. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, the hesitation answered the question before words ever could. For months, Rachel had believed she was building a future with a successful developer, a wealthy businessman, a man positioned to control substantial assets. Now she was beginning to understand something very different. The projects weren't his. The properties weren't his. The fortune wasn't his. The future wasn't what he'd described. And once that realization arrived, it refused to leave. A week later, she stopped mentioning houses, stopped mentioning vacations, stopped mentioning plans. The conversations became smaller, safer, more cautious. Johnson noticed immediately, but by then, he was too busy trying to hold reality together to stop it. Then one day she didn't answer. At first, he assumed she was busy. A meeting, work, life, nothing unusual. Then she didn't answer the next message. Or the next. The silence stretched. Hours became days. Days became a week. Johnson kept telling himself there was an explanation, a misunderstanding, a problem, something temporary. But deep down, he already knew. One evening, he sat alone in his apartment, scrolling through old messages, photos, conversations, plans, promises, future discussions, entire months built around a life that now looked impossible. For the first time, he saw the pattern clearly. Almost every conversation centered around what was coming next. The future house, the future investments, the future lifestyle, the future wealth, the future, always the future. Very little about the present. And suddenly he understood something he didn't want to understand. Rachel hadn't fallen in love with reality. She'd fallen in love with the future. The same future he'd fallen in love with himself. The difference was that she walked away when she realized it wasn't real. He couldn't, because he was the one who created it. A few weeks later, a mutual acquaintance confirmed what everyone already suspected. Rachel was gone, completely. No dramatic goodbye, no public confrontation, no final explanation. She simply left. And in some ways, that hurt more, because there was nobody to argue with, nobody to blame, nobody to convince, only silence. The kind of silence that forces people to sit alone with their own decisions. For months, Johnson had imagined the divorce as the beginning of a better life. Now he was sitting alone in a quiet apartment, staring at a phone that rarely rang. Rachel was gone. The fortune was gone. The future was gone. And for the first time, there was nobody left sharing the fantasy with him. That was when the real loneliness began. Not when Sheila left. Not when the marriage ended. When the illusion ended. Because illusions can feel comforting. They explain things, promise things, protect people from uncomfortable truths until reality arrives, and reality had finally arrived. The worst part was that it didn't come with anger or revenge or dramatic consequences. It came with something much harder to fight. Truth. The truth about what he owned. The truth about what he didn't. The truth about who built the life he'd taken for granted. And once people see the truth clearly, they rarely choose the fantasy again. Rachel certainly didn't. By the end of the year, she had disappeared from his life entirely. No calls, no messages, no future. Just a chapter that ended exactly the way it began, built on promises that were never real. The problem for Johnson was that Rachel wasn't the last thing he was going to lose. Because while heartbreak eventually heals, reputation is much harder to rebuild. And reputation was already starting to slip away. For a while, Johnson convinced himself things would recover. People recover from divorce. People recover from failed relationships. People recover from mistakes. That was what he kept telling himself, and in some ways, he was right. The problem was that the biggest damage wasn't emotional anymore. It was professional. The first sign appeared so quietly he almost missed it. An investor stopped returning calls. Not a stranger, someone he'd known for years, someone who used to answer immediately. At first, Johnson assumed the man was busy. Then another message went unanswered. Then another. Eventually, the silence became difficult to ignore. A few weeks later, something similar happened with a different contact. Then another, and another. No arguments, no confrontations, no one telling him they no longer wanted to work with him. Just distance. The kind people create when they're no longer confident in someone. One afternoon, Johnson attended a networking event in Atlanta, the same type of event he'd always enjoyed. A room full of developers, investors, lenders, business owners. For years, those rooms had felt comfortable. Now, they felt different. At first, everything seemed normal. People shook his hand, asked how he was doing, made small talk, but the conversations didn't last. Someone would glance across the room, excuse themselves, move on. The pattern repeated, again and again. Polite, professional, brief. At one point, Johnson approached a developer he'd known for nearly a decade. The conversation started easily enough. Then, after only a few minutes, the man checked his watch, apologized, and left. Johnson watched him walk directly into another conversation, one that apparently couldn't wait. For the first time, he couldn't pretend he wasn't noticing. Something had changed. Later that evening, while driving home, he turned off the radio. The silence felt easier. because the truth had become increasingly difficult to avoid. People talk, especially in business, not necessarily about scandals, about judgment, reliability, decision-making, the kinds of things investors care about. And over the past year, Johnson had given people plenty to discuss: the loan requests, the assumptions, the confidence attached to things that weren't true. The stories had spread quietly, professionally, exactly the way reputational damage usually spreads, not through headlines, through conversations. Meanwhile, Sheila kept moving forward. The contrast became impossible to ignore. She never spoke publicly about the divorce, never discussed Rachel, never corrected rumors, never sought sympathy. When people brought it up, she redirected the conversation. Back to work, back to projects, back to what mattered. And people noticed that too. One afternoon, nearly a year after the divorce finalized, a mutual acquaintance ran into Sheila at a development conference. After discussing business for several minutes, the man cautiously mentioned Johnson. "He's had a rough year." Sheila nodded. "Seems that way." The man waited, expecting more, an opinion, a reaction, a story. Instead, she asked, "How's your new project going?" And the conversation moved on. That simple moment traveled farther than she ever knew, because people remember restraint, especially when someone has every reason to do the opposite. Back in Johnson's world, opportunities continued shrinking. Nothing catastrophic, just fewer calls, fewer invitations, fewer introductions, the kind of losses that accumulate quietly until one day you realize the room feels different when you walk into it. One rainy evening, nearly 18 months after the divorce, Johnson sat alone in his apartment scrolling through job listings. The luxury homes were gone. The investment plans were gone. Rachel was gone. Most of the future he'd imagined was gone too. Reality had become smaller, simpler, more practical. At first, looking for employment felt humiliating, then necessary, then normal, because eventually, people stop comparing life to what they expected. They start dealing with what exists. Listing after listing appeared on the screen: operations management, property oversight, consulting roles, project coordination. Nothing glamorous, nothing terrible, just work, honest work, the kind he'd spent years talking about but rarely understanding. Then one listing caught his attention. He clicked it and immediately sat up straighter. Luxury mixed-use development, large-scale project, high visibility, excellent compensation, exactly the kind of project he'd once imagined leading. He opened the description, read it once, then again. The project sounded familiar, very familiar, almost like something Sheila would have built. For several moments, he stared at the screen, then slowly opened the company profile. His stomach tightened, because there it was, the company name, the project, the development, all connected to Sheila. He almost closed the application, almost, but not quite. Instead, he continued reading, then updated his resume, then submitted it. The decision felt strange, maybe even embarrassing, but he submitted it anyway. Several weeks later, an email arrived. He'd been selected for an interview. For the first time in months, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long while: hope. What Johnson didn't know was that the interview would become the final mirror reality held up to him. And this time, there would be no fantasy left to hide behind. Johnson almost canceled twice. The first time was the night before. The second time was sitting in the parking lot 15 minutes before the interview, because the closer it got, the more ridiculous the situation felt. Out of every company in Georgia, out of every project, out of every possible opportunity, it had to be this one: Sheila's project, Sheila's company, Sheila's world, a world he used to think he understood. The irony wasn't lost on him. Still, he walked inside. The lobby was impressive, without being flashy. Clean lines, architectural models, project displays, photographs documenting years of construction. Years. That word stayed with him. Years. Because looking around, he could actually see the work, not the finished product, the process, the planning, the thousands of decisions hidden behind every completed building, things he used to dismiss, things he used to joke about. Now they surrounded him. A receptionist greeted him, checked his name, then asked him to wait. Johnson sat in a leather chair near the window. A large model of the development stood across the room. People moved through hallways carrying blueprints and laptops. Meetings started, meetings ended, work happening everywhere. For a moment, he felt like an outsider, not because anyone treated him badly, because he suddenly realized how little of this world he'd ever understood. A few minutes later, a woman approached. "Mr. Johnson?" He stood. "Yes." She smiled politely. "They're ready for you." Johnson followed her through several hallways, past conference rooms, past project maps, past framed photographs showing the development from empty land to finished structures. The closer they got, the more nervous he became, not about the job, about who might be sitting inside. Then they reached the conference room. The woman opened the door and stepped aside. Johnson walked in, immediately stopping, because there she was, Sheila, sitting at the far end of the table, reviewing a file. For a second, neither spoke, neither moved. The silence wasn't hostile. It was simply real. 2 years of consequences standing in the same room. Finally, Sheila looked up, then nodded. Professional, calm, exactly the way she'd always been. "Good morning, Johnson." His throat suddenly felt dry. "Morning." She gestured toward a chair. "Please." He sat. The interview began. And that was exactly what it was. An interview. Nothing more, nothing less. No discussion about the affair. No discussion about Rachel. No discussion about the divorce. Only work, responsibilities, experience, leadership, problem solving. The questions came, one after another. Sheila listened carefully, took notes, asked follow-up questions, maintained the same professionalism she'd shown every day of her career. And somehow, that made the experience harder, because part of Johnson expected anger, or resentment, or at least some sign that the past mattered. Instead, Sheila treated him exactly the way she'd treat any other candidate, which forced him to confront something uncomfortable. She'd moved on, completely. At one point, she asked a question about managing large-scale development timelines. Johnson answered, then stopped, because suddenly, he remembered something. Years earlier, he'd mocked the very process she was asking about. The planning, the scheduling, the risk management, the endless details. Now he was sitting in a room built by those details, applying for a position that required understanding them. The realization hit quietly, but hard. The interview continued for another 20 minutes, then 30. Eventually, the question stopped. The room became still. Sheila closed the file, and Johnson knew, even before she spoke, some outcomes announced themselves. This was one of them. She stood. So did he. "Thank you for coming in." The words were kind, professional, final. Johnson nodded slowly. "Thank you for seeing me." For a moment, neither moved. Then Sheila extended her hand. He looked at it, then shook it. The handshake lasted only a second, yet somehow carried years inside it. Finally, Sheila spoke. "We'll be moving forward with another candidate." There it was. No lecture, no punishment, no revenge. Just a decision. A professional decision. Johnson nodded. "I understand." And this time, he actually meant it. Because standing in that room, surrounded by evidence of everything Sheila had built, he finally understood something he'd spent years refusing to see. Success wasn't confidence. Confidence helped, but confidence alone built nothing. Success was discipline, preparation, patience. Thousands of invisible decisions repeated over and over until they became something real, something lasting. Sheila hadn't built this project because she believed she could. She built it because she spent years doing the work. And work was the part he'd always ignored. The interview ended. Johnson walked through the lobby, past the project models, past the construction photos, past the employees moving purposefully through their day, then out into the parking lot. The afternoon sun reflected off the finished buildings in the distance. For a moment, he stopped walking, looking back at the development, looking back at everything he'd once assumed belonged to him, and realizing it never had, not because Sheila took it away, because it was never his to begin with. Then he got into his car, started the engine, and drove away. What he didn't realize was that their final chapter still hadn't happened. That would come nearly 2 years later, on opening day, when both of them would finally see exactly where their choices had led them. The development officially opened 22 months later. By then, most people had forgotten the divorce. Life tends to move that way. What feels like the center of the world eventually becomes an old conversation. New projects appear. New stories replace old ones. People move on, and for the most part, so had Sheila. Opening day was important, not because it proved anything, because it represented years of work. Years. That was the word everyone kept using. Years of planning, years of negotiations, years of setbacks, years of decisions nobody would ever see. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was scheduled for noon. By 11, the property was already crowded. Investors arrived first, then local officials, business leaders, community partners, reporters, photographers. The entire development buzzed with energy. People walked through retail spaces, explored public gathering areas, toured finished residences, admired the landscaping. The result looked effortless, the way successful projects often do. What nobody saw were the thousands of difficult days hidden underneath it. Near the center of everything stood Sheila, greeting guests, answering questions, thanking partners, moving from conversation to conversation, exactly the way she always had. Calm, prepared, focused. The event wasn't about her. It was about the work. A little before noon, Johnson arrived. Not because he had been invited personally. The event was public. Anyone could attend. For several minutes, he stood near the back of the crowd, watching. Nobody paid much attention to him. A few people recognized him. Some nodded politely. Others didn't notice him at all. For the first time in years, he was completely comfortable with that, because he wasn't there to impress anyone anymore. He was there to see something. The ceremony began shortly afterward. A city official spoke first, then one of the investors, then several project leaders. Finally, Sheila stepped onto the stage. The applause surprised even her. It lasted longer than expected, not because people felt sorry for her, because people respected her. Johnson noticed that, immediately, the respect felt different from admiration, different from popularity, different from attention. It had been earned, slowly, over time, one project at a time, one promise kept at a time. When the applause finally faded, Sheila smiled, then began speaking. The speech wasn't dramatic. No emotional stories, no grand declarations, mostly gratitude. She thanked architects, engineers, construction crews, city planners, investors, people whose names would never appear in newspaper headlines, people who actually helped build the project. Listening from the back, Johnson found himself noticing something strange. She never once talked about herself. Not once. Instead, she talked about the work, the process, the team, the responsibility. And suddenly, a memory surfaced. Years earlier, sitting at a charity dinner, telling people they spent too much time planning, telling people confidence mattered more, telling people success was simple. At the time, he'd believed every word. Now those words sounded ridiculous, because standing in front of him was physical proof of everything he'd misunderstood. The project existed because people planned, because people prepared, because people paid attention to details, because people did difficult work long before anyone noticed. The ceremony ended. Guests spread throughout the property. Conversations resumed. Photographs were taken. Business cards exchanged. The celebration continued. Johnson remained where he was, watching, reflecting, not bitter, not angry, just thoughtful. For years, he'd convinced himself that success was something you stepped into, something you inherited, something you naturally deserved if you stood close enough to it. Now he understood the truth. Success isn't what you're near. It's what you build. The distinction seems small until it changes your entire life. Eventually, the crowd began thinning. People returned to their cars. Lunch reservations, afternoon meetings, normal life. The event was ending. Johnson started walking toward the parking lot, then stopped, because across the property, he saw Sheila. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Nothing dramatic happened. No speech, no emotional reunion, no final conversation. Just a simple nod, a small acknowledgement. Two people recognizing each other. then moving on, and somehow that felt right, because there wasn't anything left to say. The lessons had already been taught. The consequences had already happened. The choices had already spoken for themselves. Johnson continued walking, the afternoon sun reflecting off the glass buildings behind him, buildings he once thought represented luck, or confidence, or opportunity. Now he understood what they really represented. Work, years of it. As he reached his car, one final thought crossed his mind. The biggest mistake he'd made wasn't the affair. It wasn't Rachel. It wasn't even the divorce. Those were symptoms. The real mistake happened much earlier. The moment he started believing someone else's achievements belonged to him. The moment he stopped respecting the work because he only saw the reward. And by the time he finally understood the difference, the life he'd taken for granted was gone. Not because Sheila destroyed it, not because fate punished him, because he spent years misunderstanding the very thing he claimed to value. Meanwhile, Sheila remained exactly where she'd always been, building, planning, working, moving forward. And in the end, that was why she won. Not because Johnson lost, not because Rachel left, not because the divorce went her way. She won because while everyone else was talking about the future, she was creating it. One decision at a time, one project at a time, one day at a time, the same way she'd always done. And that, more than anything else, was the difference between dreaming about success and actually earning it. Before we finish this story, I want to ask you something. Do you think Johnson ever truly loved Sheila? Or do you think he fell in love with the lifestyle and success that came with being married to her? Let me know in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious to see how many people believe he loved the woman, and how many believe he only loved what she built.
Thank you for watching Mr. Graham's stories, my beautiful, amazing family.